Hello and welcome back to Editorial, the podcast where we talk about all the things we got wrong. I'm joined by, that can't make you laugh every time. I always say the same thing and every time you get a snigger. You've got to get used to it.
Laugh,
you are, it's too easy an audience member.
Just a happy bloke, there you go.
As always, I'm joined by the affable and laughing Zac and Jack.
That's very sweet of you to say.
How you doing?
Yeah, very well. Tempered by shame at how long it's been between the last editorial and this one.
How long?
It's been about a month and 10 days.
But how long is it supposed to be?
It's supposed to be 2 weeks.
Okay.
It's this really is an explanation, not an excuse. But I mean, the reason is that I was away for most of that time, or working, but I was abroad, as it were. But then the last 2 weeks I have been back, but we have been manically rushing through the newspaper.
Rushing through respectably and making sure there's no error.
Well, yeah, exactly. We're spending all our time quality controlling the newspaper so it doesn't have the same error rate as our usual videos, which would be catastrophic.
It would be pretty bad.
So that is why, I mean, again, explanation, not an excuse. I mean, clearly in some sense we overextend ourselves because the cost of doing that was we couldn't do this, and that is suboptimal. But hopefully that will sort of resolve itself over time, because we've talked about this, but the next newspaper is not going to be quite so rushed, because this one was specifically about the UK election, which meant that we sort of had to wait until the last minute to do a lot of it. And actually quite a lot of the stories in there have ended up being quite time sensitive. A few of them are already out of date. Still buy the thing, obviously it's great, but some of them are already out of date. And then this one is going to be
the worst sales pitch.
More of a sort of like year in review one, and we've already been able to start making.
We've started it already.
Yeah, exactly. So we're better prepared for the next one. It shouldn't impede the normal workflow in the way that this one has. But this is very boring for anyone who doesn't care deeply about the sort of internal machinations of TLDR.
I mean, why are you watching this video if you don't care?
Fair point.
That's the only reason you're here.
Yeah.
Okay, that aside, how have we done in the last 50-ish days, 40-something days?
I think it's fair to say that, and I don't know really how we're going to do this editorial because obviously there's so much content to cover, but I think it's fair to say that in the aggregate, the number of small errors has gone up, which is very frustrating, obviously, because we actually, I don't know how many people noticed, but we've been tracking errors, and we implemented some procedures to try and minimize the number, because obviously, I'd say about a year and a half ago, there were really quite an unpalatable number of errors, and I think we had a sort of change of thinking in the office where we decided that was actually hurting credibility and we needed to sort it out. We implemented some procedures. We did, at least for a couple of months, actually really reduce the number of errors. We track the total number of errors, and the frequency really did dip. I would say that in the last couple of weeks, it has probably increased. This is fundamentally just because of the reason we just mentioned. We were slightly overextended and we were doing too much newspaper stuff. Again, explanation, not an excuse, and we shouldn't have overextended ourselves. We should have paced ourselves better and had a better sense of what we've been able to do.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'll have learned for the next time around, and hopefully also this again will sort itself out. I think that probably most of the new errors would probably come on EU and global. The UK content, in part because it's been sort of like the news cycles have been very giving in the last however many weeks and months, because it's just been election stuff, and we're obviously very familiar with that, and covering that stuff isn't necessarily that difficult. But there have been a conspicuous number of errors, I would say, on EU and global.
Should we tackle the big ones? Because with the small errors, we've kind of, apologies for those. We have a better process for next time, so this disruption doesn't impact it.
Sure.
But that is hopefully a temporary thing, and if it's not, we can discuss that in length in 2 weeks when we're definitely back.
Sure.
The bigger errors,
the
more substantial kind of editorially ones.
I think, okay, sure, let's do that like that. I think that on EU, let's start with EU, because I think there's probably in a sense less to say there, because sure, there have been some slightly more controversial videos, but actually, in general, the like-dislike ratio has been pretty good. I think the video that got the most pushback, and we know this, is the Poland video, which we should talk about, which is titled as Why Poland's Centrist Government is Struggling, and the thumb is Why Poland's Government is Failing. Yeah, I think we have to be transparent here. This was a video that we sort of wanted to do in the aftermath of the European elections.
Yeah.
And I think, depends what polls you're looking at, but Tusk slightly underperformed the polls. We actually originally decided against it when that first happened, because we didn't think there was enough of a story there. But when when I was away and we were slightly short for scripts, essentially, we said that thought basically that's better than nothing, as it were, going out on EU. I think it's fair to say that in retrospect, we agree internally this was a mistake and we can actually only apologise for that. But we put that out, and fundamentally the pushback we got from the audience, there were some specific errors in there. I think the main one is that actually, at least in one of the proposed thumbs, the main one of the graphs, the labels of the parties are the wrong way around, which implies that the right is doing better, or Law and Justice is doing better than they actually are.
Yeah.
But the pushback is, we fundamentally agree with it. And the pushback was that the original title and thumb were framed more around like why the right is on the rise, which was unnecessarily clickbaity, and it doesn't really match up to the data. I mean, the more honest thumb and title, which we've since changed to, is more about the fact that Tusk is struggling slightly. And the other thing is that, and this is the thing I think that people are pushing back on as well, is that Tusk's struggling slightly, but not all that significantly. I mean, not much more than you'd expect. It's not necessarily story worthy, and that was the sort of editorial decision we came to after the European elections. And so the fact that people push back on that is entirely understandable. And in retrospect, we actually agree we shouldn't have put the video out. We agree with that complaint. We can only apologise. But yeah, so that was, I think that's the most controversial one, as it were. But I think that clears it up. I think we basically agree with the criticism and we can only apologise. We've kept it up there almost for honesty's sake. We were tempted to take it down, but I think this has been a process is to address it on the editorial. But yeah, I thought that was a weak point. Again, apologise for that. I guess I have to move on. There were some smaller errors. We'll just go off them very briefly. I mean, there's some smaller errors in the Hungary economic crisis one. We used the Bulgarian flag instead of the Hungarian flag at 2:30. The Bulgarian and Romania were switched in a map showing which countries had exceeded the EU deficit. And there was a point when we were talking about the Visegrad group and the labels were incorrectly applied on those countries. They can only apologise for that. That's just not good enough. You can't have 3 errors in a video. But that is again, explanation not excuse. It's a consequence of the fact that we just were slightly overstretched at that time. I think that is, maybe the only other one worth mentioning is the Patriots for Europe video, which has a sort of like-dislike ratio of about 95%. The main error there was actually entirely my fault, which was that talking about Chega, which is the sort of Portuguese anti-establishment group, we say that they left the ECR when they actually left the ID. I'm annoyed at myself because I think that video was actually sort of prescient. It was one of those things that it was in the news cycle very, very briefly, and then it sort of died down. But then actually this new Patriots group did emerge, and if that video had been better, I think it would have been one of those videos that could have done quite well, essentially.
Sure.
So I think those are probably the two in the EU content that I think are worth mentioning. I'm actually looking back over them. In general, that's pretty good. That most of them are actually fine. I still think when we've been tracking them, in the aggregate, the errors have been higher, but it looks like they've been concentrated in a handful of videos. Global, there are quite a few ones. People who watch this podcast regularly will know that the way we normally sort of select for videos is we look at the like-dislike ratio, and if it's below 96.5, there are a lot of videos that fall below that threshold, but actually, quite a lot of them aren't. It's not necessarily down to errors. It's often actually down to the fact that they're about a more controversial topic, or they've done quite well. In general, when videos sort of go beyond the core audience, they receive more sort of pushback, and that takes the like-dislike ratio down a little bit. In general, most of the American content has a slightly lower like-dislike ratio. Again, I don't think there's very many errors in them. I'm just looking through them. The most recent one we had, the two most recent videos, one was about Kamala surging in the polls, or Kamala surges in the polls, can she beat Trump? How popular is Kamala Harris is the thumb title. There were a couple of minor errors in that one. I think the most obvious one was that the Michigan was...
Yeah, it's a map thing.
Michigan was shaded instead of Ohio.
I think we do need to be careful. I think maps is common error spot in the graphics, and maybe it's something we ought to intentionally flag and pay more attention to, because it's a really visual, kind of easy thing to spot, which obviously isn't ideal, and also is like hopefully a relatively easy one to double check.
Yeah.
But I guess it's not like a spelling error. If you don't know which one Michigan is as the person viewing it, you have to actually manually double check. But it's something we probably ought to be doing.
Yeah, it is annoying that those map ones do slip through. And we've got better on EU, I think, because the animators, like animators there, but you have that standardized list of maps that does seem to help. And we probably do something similar for US content ahead of the election. On top of that, I also quoting JD Vance, I said 100% pro-abortion
which obviously isn't true.
100% pro-life. I mean, that's an embarrassing error as well.
I mean, I also should have noticed when I said it, unless it was Ben, in which case he really should have noticed.
One of us should have really got that. And then finally, there was the use of Latin X, which proved controversial. That was not a sort of conscious editorial decision. I think we were copy and pasting a graph. I don't think it's particularly deep either way which one you use. I think obviously Latin X it's not commonly used at all. It's normally used to like designate non-binary Latino people, I think is the correct turn of phrase there. And it's very much American, and I think it's true that very few Spanish-speaking people like that turn of phrase. So I think in the future we'd probably just use Hispanic or Latino. I don't think it's particularly big issue either way. But I think it signals. It's not a sort of like explicit commitment, but it sort of signals your
the people who use that lean left. So therefore, by us using it, the implication is
and I get that.
Especially because that's a video that broke out into an audience that doesn't know us.
Yeah,
you can easily see how you see that and think, oh, they're those people. Nothing wrong with those people, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, so I think that's all the errors in there. And then there's this controversy on the current Lebanon video. We did a video on Israel is about to invade Lebanon. People point out that we've done similar videos in the past. That's true, but this is just because the tensions on the sort of Israel-Lebanon border do occur every so often. And there's, the same question arises every time that happens. The question is, how does this escalate? Where does this go from here? Is Israel going to invade Lebanon? So I don't think we have anything to apologise on that front. But there's been pushback on our use of the turn of phrase young people when describing the people who were killed in the attack. It's people saying we should have used the phrase children, in that sort of young people is like a particular synonym or not synonym or turn of phrase that is used to sort of dampen sympathy.
Sure, which makes sense.
Which I get. You can see that. It was not a conscious choice. We are using those two terms synonymously. That's evident by the fact that later on in the video we used the turn of phrase children. I actually appreciate that there is a subtle difference there, but I think you can use the two synonymously, and I don't think it necessarily reflects any bias there. I think the fact that we use both in the video demonstrates that. I think if we were sort of like very aggressively picking one of them, then maybe there would be cause for like concern or upset, but I think the fact that we flip between them without really making any distinction is a symptom of the fact that we are treating them synonymously. But I understand the issue or the accusation there. The other global videos that have been controversial, the Milei Argentina exits the recession, have Milei's reforms worked? That has a like-dislike ratio of about 94.7, 95. A lot of that does seem to be that Milei ends up being quite a controversial figure. I think that there was some controversy over use of this sort of proxy for economic activity as GDP. I actually take that point. I apologise for that. We should have explained in more detail what that particular proxy measure was. It's not quite the same as GDP. It's one of Argentina releases GDP statistics quarterly, and this is a sort of like month-on-month proxy for economic activity, which is taken by some analysts as a proxy for GDP. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we should have made more of that, and I can only apologise for that. And then there's also like overriding concern that when we do like economics videos, we don't like pay sufficient attention to like the suffering of the Argentinian people, especially. Basically the sort of like humanitarian side to that story. I see that point. I think it is just fundamentally like a video that's centered on economics, and so I don't necessarily think it needs to spend too much time on the sort of humanitarian costs. I'm not appealing to that as a general rule. I'm not saying that in videos on economics you can just ignore any humanitarian element. I think it's sort of got to go by case basis, I guess. I don't think there's a general rule that says like, okay, you have economics videos and then you have like humanitarian videos, and those two are sort of like separated in binary. But I'm not too squeamish about focusing on the economics in the context of the Argentina one. I think partly because I think there's just enough to say, and I think that I worry about the video becoming very busy and fundamentally less informative if you're trying to simultaneously cover off all of the sort of like, I mean, when you say humanitarian, you're covering a lot of ground there. You know, it's not just about the fact that like the poverty rate has increased sharply. You've got to talk about like the distributional consequences. You might, if you're trying to be fair, make a sort of humanitarian case in the other direction. You know, say that like, you know, in the off chance these reforms pay off, there might be a sort of humanitarian argument for these reforms because the short-term increase in poverty and suffering might be outweighed by the subsequent increase in stability. You see what I mean? And whether you're sort of getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole that means that the script could end up getting quite busy. But again, I'm not saying that there is this like general binary rule, the strict rule that like we don't talk about like moral issues in economics videos. And I take the point, as it were. I don't think necessarily did anything like wrong per se, but I do understand the anxiety and I do sort of look at it from, and we should probably keep it in mind for future videos.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I think is the bulk.
The big ones?
The bulk of the errors,
Okay.
I think I would say. I mean, I'm looking through, and I can't see anything else that is sort of appallingly wrong. But yeah, I think nonetheless, we've talked here about the sort of larger editorial errors, and we've overlooked the smaller errors, which definitely have increased over time. But again, we can only apologise. That is our fault for, in a sense, overextending ourselves, and hopefully that will resolve itself over time. I mean, immediately, ideally. Hopefully that will just, this will be it. But yeah, I think that is sort of everything. Again, I know we always say this and then we never do it, but
we will be back in 2 weeks' time.
we will be back in 2 weeks' time.
We will.
We will.
Or
we're proper.
Consequences.
Or why don't we leave it up to the audience?
No, that's
to suggest.
risky.
Okay, fine.
The top voted comment.
Not
if
the
it's
top. We're not committing to this. We're not committing to it. Okay, fine. Well, actually, that's a pretty good incentive, isn't it?
It's a very good incentive.
Fine. If we don't do it in 2 weeks, man, let me just check. I'm away in August.
Oh no. Where are you going? Because I want to fly out and see you if it's somewhere nice.
I'm off to Devon.
Okay, I can't remember this.
Yeah. Okay. If we don't, let's do one more this month, next month, even August.
One in August.
We'll do at least one in August, either next week or in 3 weeks' time.
I think we should do 2 in August. There's 4 weeks in August.
Okay.
We ought to do 2 of them.
Okay, so that means one. This is so boring. That means one next week, I guess, and then one in the 3rd week. Well, I guess this is 4th week as well, so you could do.
We've got options. There'll be 2 in August.
2 in August.
2 in August.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. That's a good incentive.
We'll see you at some point. Otherwise, Zac has to do something.
Well, it can be Jack as well. No, it can be you. It's the top voted comment. All right.
We will see you soon.
Thank you.